I called the police and they took me to Avenue 15 Youth Shelter, which is where the cycle of homelessness really perpetuated itself. I eventually just didn't want to go back home, and I tried to a few times. I actually felt safer being homeless and experiencing homelessness in many ways than, being back in that circumstance. I had been traumatized already.
In a world that feels like it's continuing to divide, where we're putting up walls against anyone different than us, and we avoid conversations because we're so scared of saying the wrong thing. Through this, we've lost our ability to connect and really understand one another. As someone who struggled to come out, I know how isolating it can feel to be defined by a label and misunderstood. Last season, I sat down with incredible people, and in just an hour, I learned so much more about them and how we can truly support one another. The tools we uncovered were powerful, showing how vulnerability and listening can bring us together. There are so many more stories to tell, and I'm excited to dive deeper this season.
My name's Chaz Smith. I am the CEO and founder of Be the Change YYC Street Outreach Program. I am 34 years old. I am a man and I identify as being a gay man, and I am a person who believes in empathy, compassion, dignity, and ultimately humanity.
And are you able to tell us about some of the struggles that you've gone through with different labels?
Let's talk about being unhoused. When I was unhoused, I felt ignored. I started to notice people wouldn't look at me, make eye contact. I think this is a self-defense mechanism for many people because they just don't know what to do. And you notice that. And then over time, you feel like you are just that and homeless. And that creates mental health, anxiety, depression, and furthers the cycle of homelessness ultimately.
Right. You mentioned that people don't know what to do with eye contact and stuff. I feel like it's probably a simple answer, but what is the answer to that?
I think like any person who's looking at you, trying to make eye contact, you just make eye contact and you can nod.
Yeah.
If somebody's asking you for change, you can say not today or not this time, but walking by and simply ignoring someone I know it's a defense mechanism, but it's not helpful though.
Totally. And I think like it is a simple question and a simple answer, but it's looking at somebody as if any human has walked up to you and asked you a question.
Yeah.
And you respond.
Exactly.
Or you smile or you nod. You were saying about people avoiding eye contact, and you started to feel that in you.
Yeah.
Can you go back to a moment that really stands out to you?
Well, what I can say is that, there was many times where, that depression, anxiety, as knowing folks generally didn't want to acknowledge me.
Right.
That, I had like this plan of, I'd put rocks in my pocket and go up to one of these towers, and I just wanted to smash a window and jump. So I can speak towards that impact that fueled with inside of me.
Right.
And that, that guilt, that shame, all those places that I wouldn't wish on anyone.
What was the journey like
for
you becoming unhoused, and then the journey after that?
It's so interesting because I have a great relationship with my parents and my family today.
Okay.
And that's not something that everyone gets, that healing, that opportunity that comes.
Right.
I grew up in a very tumultuous home life is how I would describe it. Probably things no kid should have to go through.
Right.
My sister and I both ended up in children's services. So we actually both ended up homeless. and we were youth. The first time I experienced homelessness was after an incident took place, and the police actually came, and for my safety, they took me to a shelter for my very first time.
Okay.
At that place, I learned that my story wasn't actually that unique, that there were so many more youth that had experienced a lot of the same things, and that's where they were. Eventually, you know, bouncing back and forth between my parents and another event, I called the police, and they took me to Avenue 15 Youth Shelter, which is where the cycle of homelessness really perpetuated itself. I eventually just didn't want to go back home, and I tried to a few times. I actually felt safer being homeless and experiencing homelessness in many ways than, you know, being back in that circumstance. I had been traumatized already. I wasn't willing to continue doing that. So I had, at that point, had a lot of my own baggage, where even if the circumstances had changed, I didn't want to be in a family unit again.
When you're talking, like, all I can imagine is you as a young kid finding yourself without a place to go.
Mm-hmm.
What was that like, and how did you navigate that? Like, I don't even know how I would.
That's a great question, and you know, it's over half a lifetime ago for me
Right.
now. I do remember the first day when the police brought me to a shelter. They had brought me previously to a shelter too,
Okay.
but at this moment where my journey really continued into that cycle, I know I just like cried. I was afraid. I was scared. And I just didn't want to live like that anymore. I didn't want to be in this trauma state all the time. I think knowing that I was a gay man in the world that we live in too was incredibly difficult, right?
Yeah.
I remember, like, you know, parts of that mental health too was when I was younger, like knowing that I was different in that way. And, you know, I was raised Jehovah's Witness,
Okay.
which I'm not, and that is not okay. And so it's almost like I tried to convince myself for a long time that this was just a feeling that would go away, and maybe if I just don't acknowledge it, it will change. And then I realized that's not going to happen.
Right.
So being different, being raised differently, experiencing homelessness, it was a compound of so many different labels that I had put on myself
Right.
at that time in my life.
Right. And so many too of society telling you, if you have this label, this is what it looks like, or it's wrong, or there's shame around it, and then you take that on. I think a lot of people don't understand, like through conversations I've had with people, how often people don't want to be who they are because they know what's going to happen, right? Like for me, it took me so long to come out because I was like, I don't want to be this person.
Yeah.
Now I love who I am, but at the time it was like, I don't want to be this person, not because of that, but because I might lose friends. I might get shut out from places that I wouldn't have. I might be left alone, right?
Yeah.
And that struggle, I had a conversation with someone the other day of that a lot of times people think that it's for attention.
Yeah.
Like, oh, this is special, right? And it's like, no, it's not special because you get shut out.
Yeah.
It's like, no, this is not the attention anybody wants.
Exactly,
right?
exactly. And I totally relate because I remember the first time I told, like, you know, my dad, and, you know, I love him and we have a great relationship and he's accepted it now.
Okay.
But it really was that, oh, you're just saying this for attention, right?
Right.
And so I know that that's a truth that people go through
Yeah.
in the world we live in, but also people know, I think, how hard being part of the queer community is.
Right.
And I think as a parent, you just don't want that for your kid too.
100%.
And you don't want them to have to go through that journey.
Yeah.
So it's the defense mechanism,
Yeah,
the labels we tell ourselves, right?
totally. When it comes to you being unhoused, was there shame and stigma around that? And what did that look like?
You know, I think the shame and the stigma was that it was interesting because I had freedom in a way that I didn't before.
Okay.
You know, I could feel safe. I could get a job. I think the shame really was that I couldn't sustain going to school anymore.
Okay.
And, you know, that I always was like, had a high IQ. I always was like an honor roll kind of kid.
Right.
And not being able to finish my education has always been something that I felt shameful for.
Right.
The circumstances of the things that I saw, right? I mean, people committing crimes and like, you know, having like weapons on themselves to protect themselves, right? And
Right.
there was a 21-day max stay at the shelter, and then you had to leave, go to another shelter. So I started smoking weed actually quite fast. I think cigarettes was the first thing that I started, and I felt better.
Okay.
And then, you know, I started, you know, picked up smoking pot, and, you know, that became my crutch, that self-medication for a lot of that journey to feel better and to kind of just black it out so that I
Okay.
didn't have to feel that way. And I know, like, after the 21-day max stay once, that it was winter, and we had all, like, you know, done some other substances because we were like walking around the streets in blankets and trying to stay warm and awake all night.
Right.
So I was one of those individuals where you were clearly homeless, wandering the streets high in the middle of the night, probably terrified people, you know. And then of course you know that, right? And that's not what I wanted for myself either.
Right.
So
You didn't want to be seen like that.
I didn't want to feel like that burden.
Right.
I always say the brain is a powerful thing. It will do what it needs to survive.
Right.
And substance use is a form of survival. Whether you're homeless, experiencing homelessness, or housed,
Right.
It exists regardless, right?
Totally. Whether it's like a numbing emotional pain or something for physical.
Yeah.
Did you feel safe? Were you dreading like the end of the 21 day?
Of course, there was many times I didn't feel safe. I mean, in the winter, it's freezing cold, but you also learn where there are plus 15s and hallways that you can hang out in that people might not know you're in.
Right.
So we learned about some cool places. I can tell you that I would have been, you know, 16, 17, and my sister and I actually got a tent, and we set up that tent, and we were there for probably a couple days before another individual who was like having a psychotic event that from substances came from his camp over to ours, and he chased me, you know, yelling at me, and he had like a 2x4 with nails in it. And I was running just as fast as I could, and, you know, he chucked it at me, and he didn't thankfully hit me with it. And then I know I came back with my sister one day, and our tent was gone. And it was like all of our clothes, our food, like everything that we owned was in that tent.
Wow.
And so we went back to the shelter. She lied to try and say she wasn't 18 at the time.
Okay.
Because you can't access once you're 18.
Wow.
So I would have been 17 or 16, almost 17 then. But then they saw her name and they're like, yeah, she's not. And I think she went to the drop-in center, which I can only imagine would have been terrifying as a young 18-year-old woman going there. And then, you know, I had been in some programs, transitional housing in children's services, and I met this lovely lady, Krista Merkel, who was my youth worker. I didn't know what she saw in me.
Right.
Because I wasn't even in her program anymore. It was one of those people that looks at you and, you know, that spark that they have in their eyes, and you can kind of see it looking at you. I guess I would just call it love, right? Like true love and empathy. And after this incident, and I had been using, and I had called the program I lived at previously. It was a Sunday, and she actually called me back, and it was her day off. And she met up with me, and she took me to Tim Hortons on 17th Ave, and she bought me something to eat, something to drink. And she said, Chaz, like, I wish I could make you stop doing what you're doing. And just something about that conversation. And in that moment, I felt like this person that actually loves me.
Right.
And saw something in me that I didn't even see in myself. And that love I felt in my heart, and it kind of acted like a spark that kind of ignited something in me that made me want to make different choices and believe in myself. Because if someone saw such potential in me and felt that way about me, it made me question why I'm not feeling that way about myself.
Right.
And so that really helped me on the journey of healing.
Yeah.
And that's where I started making different decisions.
Wow. It's almost like an ally came into your life and offered you like a step out or like a different option.
Absolutely. I think, the energy that I felt from that love of this person, it really made me question why I was making the choices I was making, because I knew then that I didn't love myself.
Right.
I really had to own that I didn't.
Yeah.
And that I had some severe depression and anxiety and all the mental health that goes with that. But that opportunity allowed me, that human compassion, that human connection allowed me a moment to kind of have a mirror to look at myself and question, if someone else can see such potential in me, why am I not seeing this, right?
Totally. Are you able to talk a little bit more about the cycle of being unhoused and anything that you've seen to stop that cycle?
Yeah. Well, first I want to say is that folks that are unhoused, it's fairly simple in a way. They need housing. Folks become unhoused for a multitude of reasons. I think that, we know contributing factors, being a minority, being marginalized, domestic abuse, mental health, substance misuse disorder. They are contributing factors, but so is inflation and poverty.
Totally.
And we see a very close trend of people that are in poverty that experience mental health and then also experience substance misuse, because of course poverty is painful and it creates situations where the brain needs to survive. And what I have seen is whether someone uses before they end up homeless, they probably will end up using once they are homeless for long enough.
Right.
It's just too traumatizing to live, and they probably need antidepressants and anti-anxiety meds, and that's just not what's available.
So for you, in that moment, you're offered a different way to look at yourself. What path does your life take at that point?
So I really cherished that connection, and I was very, blessed, because what happened was a program was created called the Infinity Project. It was the first of its kind housing first program, where we were going to offer housing and the supports to maintain it. And I was the first youth put in that program.
Wow. That
That is very successful today. And so I was given housing. I was given a therapist, I was given a social worker, I was given a youth worker, and they built a plan with me where they checked on me a certain amount of days, and then, they taught me how to cook, how to clean, how to pay bills, I went back to school. I went and took my first year of carpentry at SAIT, and I'm not a carpenter. I don't like carpentry anymore, but it was a really cool journey to go down. And I just stopped using naturally because so much of it was self-medicating, and I had a therapist that helped me learn how to heal myself, right?
Right.
And so when I look at the folks experiencing homelessness today, I know that like compassion and empathy is important. And so are the services,
Right.
which is housing and supports. We know that the cost of housing is, $30,000 a year to give someone housing with supports, whereas the average cost to maintain someone in homelessness is $87,000 a year. So it's always mind-boggling to me when we look at the costs of maintaining a person in homelessness, and they far exceed the cost of providing housing and supports. And I wish that more people knew that fact of the dollars, because it's not just about the money, obviously, but to know that so much money is going to maintaining someone there when what they really want is housing and supports.
Totally. And lots of people are driven by numbers, right?
Yeah.
And so if that's what it takes for someone to say like, oh, actually we're being ridiculous with our money, like,
Yeah.
fine.
Yeah.
If that's your motivator, okay. What are all the costs that go in right now for the $87,000? Is it like hospital and that kind of thing?
Yeah, so that would be to pay for an individual living in a shelter. So there's a certain amount that a shelter is given every month. We also see that, of course, police calls go up because poverty produces crime.
Right.
When people are hungry and can't afford clothes and basic essentials of life, they're going to find it one way or the other, right?
Right.
Mental health, overdose deaths, overdose calls, fire, EMS. I mean, just to put somebody in a hospital bed because they need to have their finger amputated, just to get in that hospital bed and intake them is like, over 10 grand.
Right.
Never mind the costs associated with that amputation.
Totally.
And 50% of frostbite is people experiencing homelessness, and they receive an amputation, right?
Right.
And so when we create these systemic issues that people have no choice but to steal because they're hungry or thirsty or need, clothing or hygiene supplies, then the mental health of, a person having to live in these chronic stressors, then the substances for trying to self-medicate and all the overdose deaths that we're seeing today.
Right.
And it's mind-boggling that people aren't simply provided housing and supports, and that we have not attained affordable housing.
All of this takes me back to that moment too, where you were given this opportunity in the program.
Yeah.
What did it feel like to be given a place to stay that you knew you were safe, you knew it was stable, and you had supports too?
Well, it was humane. I felt like a human again.
Yeah.
And I was also given buffers to mess up, where, opportunities to make mistakes, and that's okay.
Yeah.
That's what Housing First is all about, is if you don't have housing, you can't deal with the other things going on in your life. I learned to recontribute back to society. I learned that I did have worth, and I learned that this anxiety and depression I had dealt with my entire life, that I could start recovering from that.
Yeah.
That wasn't the end all be all, that there was a future for me. And I learned that I could feel happy.
Wow.
And that was shocking to me, because I was not happy for a long time.
Wow.
But to feel happiness, natural happiness without substances. And I remember that being a new feeling when I was like 18, 19, as happy.
Yeah.
And I was
powerful.
amazed that people can feel happy. I think that, for me at least, I've learned to just kind of be like a phoenix that's risen out of the ashes, and that you can do that over and over and over again.
Right.
We all have a story that no one knows anything about, and yet my worst fear is still being homeless.
Is it?
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah, my worst fear is still being homeless again, and I know I couldn't live in one of the homeless shelters. I know I couldn't allow myself to be treated as a subhuman.
Right.
And I don't agree with how we are treating people in this sector as a whole. I think we can do so much better, and it's such a shame that we've allowed ourselves to just fail as a society and warehouse people in, these places that are not funded adequately, first and foremost. So we can't blame them for being such toxic environments.
Right.
And I feel bad for anyone that has to live that way. We live in tough times right now.
Yeah.
Where, my rent went from $1,075 last year to $1,550, right? And that's cheap for a 1-bedroom.
Right.
Still, but it's not acceptable.
No.
I just want to touch on that too briefly, is food, water, clothing, shelter.
Yeah.
We're all taught this in school. It's like a pyramid, right? And we're taught that these are the core needs of a human being, that we have very limited needs, actually, food, water, clothing, shelter,
Right.
but we have unlimited wants. And so, yes, experiencing homelessness is not a journey of wants. It's a journey of trying to meet core basic needs, food,
Totally.
water, clothing, shelter. So if we can meet those needs, then we allow people that inherent potential to be able to grow and manifest whatever gem is inside of them. Right?
Then you can get to the wants, but until
Yeah.
the needs are met, you can't.
Yeah,
Would you put love into that category of needs? Like just,
absolutely.
yeah,
I think if we look at things holistically, there are many more needs that individuals have.
right.
Physical needs, like of just those core needs of food, water, clothing, shelter. But, as a human psyche, we're so much more than just food, water, clothing, shelter.
Right.
We are complex creatures. We have, a spiritual journey for some. We have a physical journey, mental journey. We're so multifaceted that there's so many boxes inside of us that involve compassion and dignity and love and
Right.
Creativity, purpose.
Good one.
So, yeah, absolutely. Humans are holistically very inherently complex and, I guess, perfectly imperfect, complex creatures.
Yes. That's what they say. So once your needs were met,
Yeah.
then what was the journey after that?
I was able to get a job. And it's interesting because that whole get a job saying is, it's wonderful that people think it's that easy when we have the ability to shower every day,
Mhm.
and I can do my laundry, I can feed myself, so I'm not weak and lethargic,
Yes.
and so yes, I have the opportunity to try to get a job at that point. Without those things, how can you possibly simply just get a job? I ended up within a few years working in the homeless serving sector. I am a believer that whatever our passion is, that's part of our purpose. And so for me, I'm passionate about serving folks experiencing homelessness. And I found my purpose in that as I've understood the journey, and I look at each individual and I do see that potential in them. And it can be incredibly frustrating, as I'm sure my youth worker would say, how challenging and frustrating it was to work with me, because when folks don't see all that potential and it's just glimmering off of them, it can be frustrating, right?
Right.
And folks, many do want jobs or to go back to school. We all have dreams that we want to fulfill and visions of our future.
Right.
I don't think anyone ever wakes up one day and says, I want to be homeless.
Right.
It's just not a reality.
No, that's not on a kid's list.
So I started, after working in the sector, I worked with the Calgary Homeless Foundation, 2010, 2011, on the 10-year plan to end youth homelessness specifically. I organized focus groups, I worked at different events, and I had the opportunity to grow professionally, to learn more in the sector. I also then worked at the youth shelter Avenue 15 I previously lived at. And I went on to, in 2015, start Be the Change YYC.
Wow.
And it really was that I was seeing so many unhoused individuals, and I wanted to make a program that I know I would have needed when I experienced homelessness. One thing I identified is that we heal together as community sometimes. And there wasn't really boots on the ground outreach. We had, DOPE team, which is high intox transport. But aside from a few religious groups going out and ministering to people, I didn't see any outreach teams that were just meeting people in equitable ways on the streets in their time of need, offering those basic needs,
Right.
along with the program referrals, the knowledge of how we can, work on this journey together to get you off the streets. So we made some sandwiches, a group of friends and I, and bought some juice boxes. I think my grandma gave me some granola bars. My mom actually, I think, bought the juice boxes one time. And I just was really passionate about it. And I said, I'm going to do this every Wednesday. And we had these resource guides that we would hand out to every individual as well with the food. And I just kept at it. So it's been over 9 years now.
Wow.
A program intentionally designed to be a program that I know I would have used and needed experiencing homelessness. And it was designed to be equitable and inclusive. So while we have many team leads who are nurses and paramedics on our team, we also have folks with lived experience like myself.
Right.
Many folks that have gone through the journey of mental health or homelessness find a passion volunteering at Be the Change. And I think that's in the name, is Be the Change.
Yeah.
And that for many of us, we find that reflection of ourselves, that we are part of Be the Change. And we want to share that with others, that hope.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Can you tell us some success stories through Be the Change that you've seen?
From 2023 to 2024, we served over 16,000 individual contacts. Those folks got food, water, clothing, hygiene. I believe it's over 10,000 sandwiches. We went through something like 27,000 snack items, and 10% of those individuals received program referrals to services they didn't know previously existed to help them on their journey of homelessness.
In your story, allyship was so huge.
Yeah.
How can people be allies to people who are unhoused? How can we come in this together?
I think first we have to stop allowing ourselves to be so divided and polarized against each other first and foremost.
Right.
There's so much divisiveness in the political spectrum, and housing and homelessness, it's not a partisan issue. It's nonpartisan. It's not a political issue. It's a human rights issue.
Right.
And it is a human right in Canada. So I think it's important first and foremost for us to be educated, be part of the conversation, advocate for affordable housing, write our leaders, vote, and not allow ourselves to be manipulated and controlled by anger and fear and pain. To not let that divisiveness divide and conquer us as a society, to allow different opinions and beliefs and values, to allow civil discourse and civil debate. We never learn if we're all just agreeing all the time, right?
So true.
This is part of democracy, is being able to have different values and beliefs and coming back together still at the end of the day for what's right and just according to the country we want.
If you were to go back and you see little Chaz standing there, what would you tell little Chaz?
Don't give up. I've thought about this many times because that little Chaz still is in here, right?
Yeah.
And I think many times I have said, don't give up. Life will get better. It will get better. It's going to be okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. Thanks, Chaz. Is there anything you want to add?
I just hope that we can all learn to live together and do what's right here.
Yeah.
And I think a simple thing like housing with supports just makes sense. And it's as simple as that.
Right.
When you house people and give them supports, they'll excel,
Yeah.
just like I did.
Right.
And I just find it incredibly inhumane to not have the same opportunities that I had, because, you know, people have jobs at Be the Change now. And if I wasn't given the opportunities I was given, and if I wouldn't have taken those opportunities to become better, none of that would exist.
Totally.
Hundreds of thousands of lives will have been impacted. And any one of these individuals have so much potential that they're capable of. And I just sometimes am deeply saddened that that opportunity just isn't there as much anymore. I know the waiting lists are incredibly long. Housing, for many of us, doesn't exist, affordable housing.
Right. Yeah.
And it's not a political debate to that. It's a human right.
Yeah.
So,
Thank you.
yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah.